What's going on, everybody, and welcome to episode 79 of the Book Binge, where we are doing yet another monthly reading wrap-up and TBR video. This one's coming fresh off the press because today, the day that I'm recording, is May 1st. This video comes out on May 2nd. Normally, these videos are, done and over with and uploaded, scheduled for release, usually like 3 to 5 days before they actually come out, if not more, depending on what day the first Tuesday of the month is. This time, it's the first of the month. Wanted to make sure I got through the one book that I was trying to finish last month before I actually recorded this. Otherwise, I would have just recorded early yesterday. Either way, regardless, March was nothing short of a slow reading month for me, if you remember, because of having to get through Count of Monte Cristo. Things started to get a little rough for me. Like, I started to feel burnt out at some point in the month. Not because Count of Monte Cristo was bad or anything like that, but because it was just a lot to be reading an absurd amount of pages in this book every single day and still feel like I was making little to no progress. April, on the other hand, was completely different because I did an absurd amount of reading. And it was, a ton of books that I got done, even if most of them were really short and easy. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get into what I read last month in April. Like I said, it was an absurd amount, so we're just going to start right off and not talk a whole lot about each entry. First off, we have Gregor and the Prophecy of Bane, Book 2 of the Underland Chronicles. This was one that felt very similar to the first book in a lot of structural ways. Not necessarily a bad thing, that's just kind of how the book turned out being. I thought it was pretty decent. I thought it did a little bit better than the first book did in a couple regards, a little bit worse than the first book did in a couple other regards. So that one I finished up not too long after that. I did also do 127 hours between Rock and a Hard Place. I can't remember if I started this last month or not. I'm actually going to go ahead and check. So yeah, it does seem like I had started 127 hours near the end of the month of March. That's not a problem because I did get it finished this month. This one isn't a YA or middle grade read like most of what I got through this month was, but it's not necessarily super complex. It's not horribly long either. It's only like 340 pages, so it's, nothing too difficult to get through. The only thing that makes it hard or difficult to get through is some of the content that's in it, just, in terms of real life violence, but violence isn't necessarily the correct term for it. But either way, this was one that I had nostalgia for that really, really heightened my reading experience this month. Same thing with The Card Turner by Louise Satcher, the next book that I read in April. Another nostalgic read that I've read several times in my past, and gave another read this month, and really just, I plowed through this thing. I keep forgetting how quick and easy and just fun it is. This book is nothing short of fun. Like, there's not a whole lot to it beyond the fact that it is just a really fun reading experience, especially for me, who is nostalgic for it. That also really kind of heightened my reading experience through the course of the month, which I am grateful for. Next up, I did read the third book in the Underland Chronicles, Gregor and the Curse of the Warm Bloods. This one, in most regards, was better than either of the first two books in the series. I think it was the first one in the series that I decided to give a 5 stars on Goodreads, because a lot of that had to deal with a plot twist that came in it as a result, where, certain elements of the prophecies and the quests of the first couple books, I mean, there are like little twists here and there as is, because the prophecies are kind of vague and they're meant to be. But the third book especially did that. It did that in a very brilliant way, I think, as well. Next book was The Lost Hero by Rick Riordan. First book in the Heroes of Olympus series, a series that I remember very much loving and still very much do. After rereading that love is definitely confirmed. Holds up even better than I think Percy Jackson does in my mind. This book was absolutely incredible. I loved everything about it on this reread. There was not a thing about it that I think I disliked. So there was that. Then the next book that I read was the only book that I read in full this month that wasn't like a YA book, and that being The Way of Adan by our friend Philip Chase. I haven't been able to, talk to him very much personally about the book yet, but I absolutely loved this thing, and I'm not just saying that out of some like personal commitment or anything like that. I'm saying that because I genuinely did really love it. I loved the way that it twisted a lot of common tropes on their head, or in a way that made them just fresh enough. I love the way that it had a very classic fantasy feel without being quite as predictable most of the time, and without being, quite as repetitive or as this has been done before, as a lot of other classic fantasy can sometimes be, you know? This was one that I enjoyed a lot. Cannot wait for the next books to release this year. In fact, the fact that all of the books, are going to be out this year is a godsend because it was really an incredible book. I loved it a lot. Next book that I read was The Son of Neptune, so the second book in Heroes of Olympus. I'm surprised that I got through this book this month. I was thinking for a second that it may bleed into today, but then I ended up finishing it way early because I plowed through it for a couple days. Very good. I think it's a very ever so slight step down from The Lost Hero for the reasons that plenty of the structure of this book is very similar to The Lost Hero, and it's meant to be that way. The two books are, in a lot of senses, supposed to be sort of mirror images of each other to an extent. So that's what these books are doing. In fact, now that I look at it a bit more, yeah, they are very much mirror images of each other, and very much intentionally so. They're doing a lot of the same things on opposite sides of the aisle before the books meet up in the third book, and I remember that quite well. The very first scenes of the third book are stuff that I remember most from Riordan's stuff. Just off the top of my head, I just remember it so well. Very good, not quite as perfect as I think The Lost Hero stood up to be, but, all things considered, I have no reason to complain. Then finally, after The Son of Neptune, I did get one more book in. In fact, I barely did because it was Gregor and the Marks of Secret, fourth book in the Underland Chronicles. This one, I was only through part 1 when it was yesterday, so the last day of April, but then I just spent like 4 hours in the morning just plowing through the last 2 parts, so like over 200 pages. I just plowed all the way through that because I was enjoying it so much and because I was hoping to get it done before the end of April, and it worked. This one, I think, in some respects, is actually my favorite of the Underland Chronicles up to this point, even if it's not necessarily the best, quote unquote. I think the reason why it's not the best is because it's very much clearly a setup for book 5. It doesn't quite follow the narrative episodic nature of the first 3 books, so it doesn't stand alone quite as well. It does stand alone, but not enough. Books 4 and 5 I see now and that I never noticed before are actually pretty much just the same book. They're the same story. It's continuation. I mean, they're 2 parts of that same story, but yeah, book 1 or book 4 is just set up for the final book. So I enjoyed it a lot for that reason, but because it is just set up, it doesn't really, it's hard to justify saying it's the best of, the 4 books up to this point. So I think it's just below Curse of the Warmbloods for that reason, but for a lot of just enjoyment purposes, it is also my favorite so far, I think. And that's just all the books that I read. I'm glad that I managed to get through that in less time than I was thinking I would. It was a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 full books read, 2 books finished, and then I also got an absurd amount of poems read by Edgar Allan Poe. I'm not going to read all of the titles of the ones that I read. There was like 16 or 23 of them. It seems like my notes say there's 23 of them, so I'm not going to read all those titles, but it was a lot. It was quite a few. Some notable ones that I read this month were Evening Star and A Dream, and I think A Dream is my personal favorite of all the poems up to this point, followed shortly by the poem just called Dreams that I read a couple months ago, so that's kind of ironic, but yeah, so those were a couple of my favorite poems that I read this month. But if you want to know all of the ones that I read this month, I did do a weekly update, or bi-weekly update, sorry. I think it was on April 16th. I think that's the one where I went over all of the poems that I read in April. So if you're interested, you can go check out that video, but if not, totally fine. Now that we've gone through all of that and plowed through everything that I read this month, because it was a lot, I finished a lot of books. What's my book of the month? Well, I think depending on how I talked about some of the books, you might be able to guess, but I'm going to go ahead and say that The Way of Dan was my favorite book. It surprised me a lot. I thought it was just fantastic. Nearly everything about the experience was very good to me. And by the way, this paperback is actually very high quality. I will just, go ahead and throw that in there because I can. But another reason why I think I enjoyed it so much was because I think I forgot to actually include this on the review that will be coming out next week for the video. Something that this book did to me specifically was it very much made me want to write. The entire, vibe of the story essentially just made me really want to write. Every single time I read this in the morning or whatever, I just wanted to set the book down, come to my computer, and just write, which I didn't end up doing because I was trying to take April off from doing a lot of writing stuff, just as a sort of break after doing what I did in February and March. But man, like it was really making me want to write, not because the book was bad, obviously, it was my favorite book of the month, I think, but because just the tone and the vibe was just like, I want to write now, please let me write, but I forced myself not to. But either way, yeah, very good book. And now we can talk about some of this month's reads. And in fact, I'm cheating just a little bit because a couple of these I have already started. In fact, I actually forgot to note one of these things as well. So let me go ahead and fix that real quick. So the primary thing, if you had been following along on the channel as of the last couple weeks, I did a couple different videos more or less on this topic. So you probably already know what the first item in this month's reads is going to be. That is Eye of the World by Robert Jordan, the first book in the Wheel of Time series that I've been very, very looking forward to starting and reading and getting into, anticipating very highly, essentially. I did already read a few chapters. I only read one chapter this morning, but I read the prologue. I believe I read the prologue on Friday, and I read the first 3 chapters on Saturday, and then I read chapter 4 this morning. Because like I said yesterday, I was plowing through Gregor and the Marks of Secret. But yeah, Eye of the World, I've already gotten a little bit into. I'm at chapter 5, so I'm around 50 pages in. If you include the prologue, I'm closer to 60 pages into the book already. I'm honestly having a great time. I really like the tone. I like the vibe. I like what we have been given, the way that Jordan is trickling little bits of lore and information and world and history and stuff like that. I'm very, very intrigued and interested in what is going on in the story up to this point. I'm looking very much forward to continuing. I don't have a whole lot to say beyond that, but I have already started it, and that is pretty neat. The other thing was actually came as a surprise. It was, I believe, over this last weekend when I actually decided to start doing this, and it was kind of like spur of the moment, quite frankly. I did start a reread of Empire of Silence, so Sun Eater. This isn't going to be like a huge focus for me over, the course of my reread, because I've already read the books before, so they're not going to be like my main thing. They're not going to be ones where it's just like, okay, I have a free moment to read, let's pick up Empire of Silence. I'm not going to do that. Instead, if I have free moments to read, I'm going to read some of my other stuff. This will just be kind of one of those 1 or 2 chapters a day, if I have the ability to, type of things, because I've made plans on a little project that I'm working on for Christopher Rocchio, the author of this series. So I'm actually starting to do rereads of everything in the series in order to do that. And I'm actually very excited about it. I've already read chapter 1 and 2 this morning because chapter 2 is very short. It's insane how different the first few pages of this book read after knowing what I know now, having read everything available in the series up to this point, outside of, I believe, 3 of the short stories to come in Tales of the Sun Eater Volume 3 that released in Bane Books anthologies. Outside of like 3 of those short stories, like I said, I've read everything Sun Eater related up to this point. So it's just kind of insane starting this reread already, and I anticipate that a lot of things are going to read very differently for me now, knowing what I know. I'm probably going to catch a lot of other stuff, and I'm excited for that. But yeah, that's what I started today, but that's just kind of a, side project, I suppose, when it comes to reading. Otherwise, today, as this video is rendering, actually, I'm going to begin reading The Sea Wolf, so the 3rd book in this little collection by Jack London. It is this month's monthly classic. It's not horribly long, even though it's pretty, like, twice as long as either of the other, either of the other stories in this collection, because where I have the book open at the moment is about halfway through, but that's where the 3rd book starts. So chapters in this one are short, so I think it's going to fly by relatively quickly. I don't think I've ever really heard like an actual bad thing about any of Jack London's books, so I'm actually very excited for this to be my first one and for it to be reading alongside a lot of other friends and stuff that I am very excited about. Otherwise, the other books that I'm going to talk about here, I think, are going to be just kind of if I have time, because like I said, I just started Empire of Silence as a reread on a whim, more or less this last weekend. So if I hadn't decided to do that, one of these other books I would say I'm going to start this month, but I'm not sure if I will anymore. So let's talk about a couple of those. First off, if I have the ability to, I would like to read Gregor and the Code of Claw, the fifth and final book in the Underland Chronicles, just to get the series done and over with behind me, and to get the reread done and over and behind me, and especially since this is my favorite book of the series in memory, and based off of, just how much I enjoyed book 4 on this reread, I think this one's going to rate very highly for me once I'm done with it. I don't know if I'll get to read it, but since these books are very easy, it's only like a minute per page of reading for me, and that says a lot considering how slow I read, so that says something. We'll see if I'm able to get through it this month, or if I'm even able to get to it this month, but that's just kind of an if I have time type of thing. Another if I have time type of thing, I would also like to get to the Mark of Athena, but I highly, highly, highly doubt that I'll be able to get to this one. This is the third book in the Heroes of Olympus. Like I said, highly doubt that I'll be able to have time for it, but it's just kind of there in case I really want to read it, or if I have time, or if I need something short. Well, it's not necessarily short, but something quicker and easier than some of these other reads that I'm doing this month. And then this is the one that I am actually potentially pushing back out of the schedule for this month as a result of starting the reread of Empire of Silence, that being Malice, the first book in Faithful and the Fallen by John Gwynne. I'm going to be reading this series this year regardless. It's just a matter of if I end up starting this book this month, or if I don't get to do it until next month when the actual technical read-along for it in Mike's Discord starts. The one that I decided to join anyway. So whether I get to this month or not, I have no clue. Even if I do get to it, it's probably just going to be like at the very end of the month with a few days left in the month, and I'm not going to get very far into it, but that's also an if I have time thing. We'll see how my other reads this month go, especially since I plan to take Wheel of Time, so the Eye of the World, very slowly. I only plan to read a couple chapters each morning, and that basically be the extent of how I read those, more or less, and then everything else is going to be pretty chaotic because of IRL stuff, which I will talk about probably more in my next Fortnite update, so that will be in a couple weeks, basically. In that one, I will talk a little bit more about all the stuff going on in my life over these couple weeks that are going to be happening. By then will have happened, and that'll be pretty crazy. Who knows what in the world I'm going to manage to get through the first half of this month? I have absolutely no clue. If I'm able to get through any of this at all, I'll be happy, because this month's going to be crazy, especially since I also graduate this month. I forgot about that. I graduate this month. Crazy work schedule should theoretically be over this month. Other personal stuff going on this month. Like, it's going to be crazy. But with that being said, thank you guys for watching this video. I believe on this Thursday is going to be the debut episode of my Wheel of Time diary. So basically where I go through and do a small portion of spoiler-free talk at the beginning of the video of what I've read in the Wheel of Time. And then I go into, more spoilery type of stuff so that I can just discuss, talk about, and ramble about, kind of my experience reading Wheel of Time each week as I read those books. So that will be the first thing that happens this Thursday. And then next Tuesday, I believe I mentioned this briefly earlier, is going to be my review of The Way of Adan by Philip Chase. So if you are interested in that book, if you haven't read it yet, or if you're wondering if it's any good or not, definitely check out that review, because I actually go quite in depth with that one. I go more in depth with that one than almost any of my reviews that I've done, and definitely more than most of my reviews I've done, let's say. So, thank you guys for watching again. I'll be back on Thursday with my first Wheel of Time diary. English is hard. And then I'll be back next week for my review of Philip Chase's debut novel. So that'll be fun. Thank you guys for watching. I'll be back in the next one.